Okay, happy Hanukkah, everyone. I thought tonight we'd speak a little bit about Hanukkah, and I think we're going to try to tackle Hanukkah from many angles, and maybe try to arrive at the core of the issue. The story is all familiar. It's the Greeks, the Syrian Greeks, occupied the temple. They defiled the oil, and when they were driven out and the temple was cleansed, there was no oil with which to light the menorah. So they searched, they found a single jar which was sealed with the seal of the high priest. It was only enough to last one day, and that wasn't long enough because it would take 8 days to procure fresh oil. Why it would take 8 days is a question. Some say because the place where the oil was manufactured was a 3-day journey. So they had to travel there. Then there was a day for the processing. They had to return. Only on the 8th day would they have the oil. Whatever the explanation is. But a miracle took place and the oil burned for 8 days. And we commemorate that with the holiday of Chanuka. Now there are a few issues here in the story. One is that if the miracle we commemorate was just a miracle that enabled the Jews to fulfill a mitzvah, it doesn't seem that's a cause for celebration. I mean, in life it often happens. We find ourselves in circumstances where we can't do a mitzvah. Let's say a person is, God forbid, in jail, so he can't put on tefillin, he might not be able to keep Shabbos as he would want, can't give charity. So it's unfortunate, but he's constrained by circumstances beyond his control. And it happens. It happens sometimes to communities as a whole. There are many places in Europe that could not obtain a lulav and esrog for sukkahs. These are plants that grow in tropical climates, and in Eastern Europe it was much too cold. You couldn't grow them locally, and they couldn't be imported from warmer places. So there were entire cities that did without. So it's unfortunate. Certainly you try to avoid that situation, but if it happens, it happens. So here, what are we talking about? There was no oil, so they wouldn't have been able to light. So God made a miracle, they were able to light. So okay, it's very nice, but certainly shouldn't be something which is a cause for a holiday for eternity. Then there's another question which is raised, that there's a halacha, there's a law that pertains to the service of the temple, which is tuma hutra b'tzibur, that the laws of ritual purity, ritual impurity, can be suspended for the sake of a communal service. In other words, if a private individual is bringing a sacrifice, it has to be totally pure. If it's defiled, it can't be brought. But in the case of a communal offering, a communal service, if worse comes to worse, there's no alternative, the laws of impurity are suspended. So in fact, the lighting of the menorah was not a private obligation, it was a communal obligation. If there was no pure oil, they would have been able to use the impure oil. So it comes out that the miracle was entirely unnecessary. It wasn't even necessary for the sake of fulfilling the mitzvah. Because if there was no alternative, if the miracle wouldn't have happened, they could have just as well used the impure oil. So, okay, it wouldn't have been the best, it wouldn't have been preferable. So the miracle is not just to facilitate the mitzvah they could have done in any case, is to facilitate doing the mitzvah in the finest possible way. Which hardly seems to be a justification for the miracle, and certainly not a justification for the celebration. Another interesting thing is that it seems from the story that everything revolves around the menorah. But the menorah was only one component of the temple. There are many other parts. There was the altar. And in fact, Chazal tell us that the Greeks who invaded the temple defiled the altar as well. The Talmud says there was a storeroom in the temple where they stored away the ruined stones of the altar. that the Greeks had broken, they had defiled. So we have a historical record that the Greeks did not only ruin the menorah and defile the oils, they also destroyed the altar. The altar had to be rebuilt. So the stones were kept as a memento, as a remembrance of what the Greeks had done. And yet, it seems that the restoration of the altar is not significant in the Chanukah story. And the reason would seem, very simply, that there was no miracle involved in the reconstruction of the altar. The altar was destroyed, but they obtained stones, new stones, and rebuilt the altar. So there was no miracle there. But there was a miracle with regards to the menorah. So we have to understand that exactly, that there must be something behind this, that the altar was repaired by natural means, and somehow the menorah could only be used with supernatural means. I can't say it's a question, but it's an observation. Now we know that the name Chanuka means rededication, and it's a reference to the rededication of the temple. And it seems that this rededication somehow revolves around the menorah. This is the symbol of the renewal of rededication, that the menorah now could be lit. As we know that when the sanctuary in the desert was built, there also was a Chanuka, there also was a dedication, and that dedication revolved around the altar, interestingly enough. And it happens to be the Torah reading for the holiday of Chanukah. Since Chanukah is a Chanukah, so when we read the Torah, we look for the story that most resembles Chanukah. So we read the story of the Chanukah of the sanctuary in the desert. And that Chanukah, that dedication, involved the altar. For 12 days, the princes of each tribe brought sacrifices, the Chanuka samizbeach, for the dedication of the altar.
And that was Hanukkah then?
It wasn't this time of year, it was in the month of Nisan. But the point is that it's the story in the Chumash which most closely resembles the story of Chanukah. Both relate to rededications, or dedications. So this was the dedication of the original sanctuary in the desert. This is the rededication of the Beis HaMikdash. But again, this odd thing, that the sanctuary in the desert, the whole dedication revolved around the altar. And this rededication somewhat revolves around the menorah. So this is something we have to really try to understand. I think that the key to this is as follows. That we have to understand what is the function of the temple. What is the function of the Beis HaMikdash? Of course, this will be hard for us to answer. We don't have the Beis HaMikdash in our lifetimes. There's never been a Beis HaMikdash. It was destroyed 2,000 years ago. We mourn it, but we're not familiar with it. So we have to use our imaginations a little bit. What is the function of the Beis HaMikdash? What are we meant to accomplish there? On the simple level, it is the place for the offering of sacrifices. Now, animal sacrifice itself requires a lot of understanding. It's not the kind of thing we're comfortable with. But the idea of animal sacrifice seems to be vicarious self-sacrifice. Because we sacrificed ourselves to the service of God. So the animal is that which most closely resembles a human being. So symbolically, the person sacrifices himself to God. What does it mean to sacrifice yourself to God? It doesn't mean suicide. It's symbolic. But it means like this. In life, we have a question of priorities. What's truly important in life? To what objectives should I devote my life? So for many people, religion is an aspect of life, but it's not the concern which underlies everything else. People have careers, and they have hobbies, and they have family, and they have social lives. Maybe they're active in their communities. And there's one aspect of life which is called religion. So what percent of a person's concern would it be? 5%, 10%, if you're especially pious. It would be perhaps 20%. You know, X number of hours a week. That's my devotion to religion. Now, I'm fond of asking people about their religions, just to see how we compare. So I have a very good friend who's a Catholic. So I asked him, tell me, how long is Mass on a regular Sunday? Just get an idea, you know, how long they sit in church. So he says, on a regular Sunday, 1 hour. And what if it's a special occasion? A special occasion, you know, Christmas, Easter, 1.5 hours. I said, okay, we're not doing so bad. You know, it seems the rabbi doesn't even clear his throat until we're 2 hours into the service. But, you know, it's an aspect of life. It's an aspect of life. For a Jew, and this might be hard to hear, for a Jew, his religion is not merely an aspect of his life. For a Jew, his religion is the totality of his life. Everything else has to fit within the context of his relationship with God. Because God doesn't want you to be a monk. Because He wants you to make a contribution to society, however you do it, whether it's in a profession, whether it's in a career, whether it's in some type of religious function. He wants you to have a family. He wants you to be a good husband, a good wife, a good father to your children, a good child to your parents. God wants all those things. But when we do those things, when we live our lives, we are living them in accordance with His will, in accordance with His expressed will in the Torah. And that's a hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing to do. Most of us look at religion as a tax. You know, in Canada we have very, very high taxes. Maybe the tax rate, all things considered, perhaps is 50% of our incomes. You know, by the time we finish with income tax and GST, PST, now the harmonized tax, you know, it's a very, very high tax rate. But we figure, okay, once we paid our taxes, we're off the hook. Now we're off the hook. We're not working for the government. Right? We paid our tax, and now what's left, a little bit that's left, is ours. So some people look at our obligations to God the same way. It's a tax we pay. We have to pay our taxes to God. But once we get God off our backs, then we're on our own. It's not that way. It's not that God is on our backs. But that's the most meaningful relationship we have with the Ribono Shel Olam. And therefore, everything we do has to fit in the context of that relationship. And that's the idea of self-sacrifice. I'm sacrificing my outside interests. That there is nothing which is extraneous to my relationship with God. Everything I do, whether it's the way I conduct my family, the way I conduct my business, the way I engage in my hobbies, the way I eat my food, is all within the context of my relationship with God. And I'm sacrificing, I'm surrendering everything else which is extraneous to that. How do you symbolize self-sacrifice? So you take an animal, you slaughter it for God, and this symbolizes a certain amount of self-sacrifice. Whereas by giving to God, by giving something to God, we symbolize our devotion to God. And that's the idea of animal sacrifice. Very powerful symbol. And that's what the temple was for. And the place in the temple, which was, of course, the location where this took place, was the altar. And when we talk about the dedication of the temple, what does dedication mean? What does it mean to dedicate something? You know, there's a great word which is used for there's something that's fell into my head, that sometimes when a synagogue hires a new rabbi, they call it installation. So I remember my Rosh Yeshiva once was invited to speak at the installation of one of his students as a rabbi. And he said, installation? You install a washing machine. You don't install a rabbi. But in any case, installation is not a great word, but there's a word similar which is used, investiture. So what the investiture? The investiture is when you invest something with a certain quality. That's the investiture. The chanukah, the dedication of the temple, is really the investiture. When you invest in it, its fundamental quality. You make it what it is. You set it on its path. In other words, if the temple is meant to be a place for sacrifice, a place where we serve God through animal sacrifice, so you set it on its path. You invested it with that significance by practicing animal sacrifice. And that was what took place in the first 12 days of the dedication of the sanctuary in the desert, that the princes of each tribe brought animal sacrifices, and this was the Chanuka. This was the dedication, the investiture, the installation, if you will, of the temple. Now, there's an interesting medrash. If you look in the Chumash, right after the description of this 12-day ritual, we have a command which is given to Aaron, the high priest, about how to light the menorah. Very strange juxtaposition. And Rashi quotes a medrash. The medrash explains this juxtaposition in the following way. It says that Aaron was dejected. Aaron felt bad, because when the 12 princes offered their sacrifices, the tribe of Levi, which was his tribe, had no share. Levi sometimes is omitted from the list of 12. Levi is a category unto itself. So Levi did not participate in the chanukah samizbeach, the investiture of the altar. So Aaron felt bad. So God wanted to cheer him up, and God said to him, don't be upset. Your portion is greater than theirs, because you get to light the menorah. So this is the medrash Rashi quotes. The Ramban asks the question, in which way is the lighting of the menorah greater than offering sacrifices on the altar? And he explores various possibilities. Are you going to say because it's a ritual which can be performed only by a Kohen, that's what makes it special? Not true, because even the animal sacrifices that the princes brought were not performed by the princes. The princes brought the animals, they contributed the animals, but the slaughtering and all the rituals have to be performed by the Kohen. So it can't be that Aaron felt bad because he had no share in the ritual, and here in the lighting of menorah he shares in the ritual. It's not true. Even the sacrifices of the 12 days were performed by the Kohen. So what's the alternative? That he was upset because he didn't make a monetary contribution? Well, the oil for the menorah also wasn't contributed by the priests. So that can't be the appeasement either. So the Ramban is perplexed as to what is God comforting Aaron by telling him that you can light the menorah. The Ramban quotes a medrash that this really is a hint to the dedication of Chanuka, because the dedication of Chanuka was through the lighting of the menorah, and it was done by the Kohanim. The leaders in the battle against the Greeks were the Chashmonoim, who were priests. But again, it doesn't fit in the simple context of the psukim. I think the explanation is as follows. The altar, we've explained what the altar symbolizes. The altar symbolizes our devotion to God, our self-sacrifice to God. We know in the temple, there's a second side to things. The temple is not only the place where we give, it's also the place where we get. There is something we receive in the temple. There is an inspiration, an enlightenment, a refinement, if you will, that we achieve through the service of the temple. And in the mystical literature we find that there were various components of the temple which were the channels through which God pours forth His bounty. The channel through which God provides certain types of bounty. For example, the Talmud says an interesting thing. The Talmud says that when a person prays at the Shemona Esrei, so we know that in our countries, which are to the west of Israel, we pray towards the east. But the Talmud says that other directions have a certain symbolism. That if a person wishes to pray for wealth, he should turn himself slightly to the north. And if he wants to pray for wisdom, he should turn himself slightly to the south. And the joke goes, and the person who can't decide, so he goes like this, tries to have both. But this is what the Talmud says, because Because north, right, is symbolic of wealth, and south is symbolic of wisdom. The simonech, and the sign of this is, if you go into the temple, into the sanctuary itself, on the north side, there was a table called the shulchan. And on this table was arranged the lechem upon him, 12 loaves of bread that were placed on the table every Shabbos, removed the following Shabbos. And that was the symbol of God's providing material sustenance. In other words, in the mystical literature, this is the channel through which God provides sustenance for the world. Because in a sense, the whole world eats from God's table. With everything we have, everything we eat, comes from God, in a sense. So in the temple you had this table, which is God's table. Bread was placed on the table. This is symbolic of the fact that we eat from God's table. If we eat the produce of this world, we're eating at God's table. And therefore, in some mystical sense, the hashpah, the influence, the flow of material sustenance is channeled through this table to the entire world. If a person wants to achieve wisdom, he prays toward the south. Why? Because the menorah is in the south. The flames of the menorah are symbolic of spiritual enlightenment. So wisdom, spiritual understanding, is channeled through the menorah to all mankind. This is the conduit through which it is transmitted. The Netziv, in his commentary to Chumash, says an amazing thing. He writes that when Moshe Rabbeinu was studying and he was perplexed by a difficult question, he would go into the sanctuary, he would stare at the flames of the menorah, and he received the answer. Because this is the channel through which spiritual enlightenment was transmitted. That's what the menorah is about. So the menorah is very different than the mizbeach, very different than the altar. The altar is the place where we give to God. The menorah is the place where we get from God spiritual enlightenment. And the temple really is a two-way channel. It's a place where we serve God, but it's the place through which we receive God's bounty. But the temple has to be dedicated. So the question is, which function of the temple is greater? The function of the temple which serves as the place for our service of God, or the aspect of the temple which is the place from which we receive God's bounty? So this is what God told Aaron. Aaron felt bad because he didn't have a share in the dedication of the altar. Meaning that in the investiture of the altar as a place for serving God, Aaron didn't have a share. So God said, don't be upset. Your share is greater than theirs. It's true, you aren't a participant in the dedication of that aspect of the temple, the aspect of the temple as a place in which we serve God, but you have a share in the dedication of the temple as the place in which we receive from God. And that's something which is even loftier. And by the way, I think that this is something we all have to think about. In other words, we practice our religion. What are we really doing? When we go to shul, we do mitzvahs. Are we doing for God? Or are we hoping to receive from God? If we're doing for God, if we think of ourselves as doing for God, we're really making a mistake. Because God doesn't need our service. He doesn't need our martyrdom. Because even when we are doing for God, we are really receiving. We're doing for ourselves. But when it comes to the altar, it's ambiguous. One can be fooled into thinking that I am actually giving something to God. When it comes to the menorah, it's crystal clear. The menorah is the place where I am receiving spiritual enlightenment from God. And that's the higher function of the temple. And that's the function of the temple that Aaron was involved with. Okay, so this gives us some insight as to the difference in the altar and the menorah. The Ramchal, Rabbi Chaim Litzat, the great mystic of the Derech Hashem, book of Jewish philosophy, devotes one very short paragraph to Chanukah and Purim together. 2 sentences to Chanukah. And in this little quote, 2 sentences, he says something very, very curious. He says that the Yavanim, the Greeks, somehow their issue, the ideology for which they stood, was counter to that which the menorah stands for. And therefore, when they were defeated, the miracle took place in the menorah. That's the whole thing. I quoted you the whole thing. In fact, I probably added some words in the explanation. But a very, very, very cryptic statement. But what he seems to be telling us is really the key to it all. In other words, somehow, when we reflect on the ideological battle between Yisrael and Yavan, between the Jews and the Greeks, somehow the ideological position of the Greeks was opposed to that which the menorah stood for, and not that which the Mizbeach stood for. And that's the key to everything. You see, it could very well be that when the Greeks came in and invaded the temple, they made a wreck out of the whole place. That's true. In other words, people don't discriminate when they invade. You know, if you have a home invasion and people come in, they'll turn the place into a shambles. And they're not going to only attack the dining room and not the living room, and only the master bedroom and not the second bedroom. You know, they go through the whole place and they turn it into a shambles. So really, Yavan, undoubtedly, they went to the temple, they destroyed everything. And they destroyed the altar, and they destroyed the menorah, and they defiled the oils, and perhaps they slaughtered the animals that were meant to be sacrifices. They made the place into a wreck. And maybe they had nothing in mind. They were on a rampage. But God wanted to show that on the ideological level, what was it that set Yavan and Yisrael apart? It relates to the menorah, not to the altar. In other words, whatever Yavan stands for, it can accept a Jewish altar. That's not a problem. We'll explain all this. But it can't accept the Jewish menorah. And therefore, in order to demonstrate that, in order to show that the victory over Yavan allows us to have a Jewish menorah, that's why a miracle took place, and that's why it took place there. So the questions we asked, what was the purpose of this miracle? After all said and done, so if they wouldn't have lit the menorah, or if they would have used impure oil, it also would have been fine. It's 100%. The miracle wasn't to facilitate the performance of a mitzvah. You're right, that wouldn't have been a tragedy, and they could have done it in any case with the impure oil. The purpose of the miracle was to impress upon the Jews that this is the point of contention. This is where Yavan and Yisrael divide. In that which the menorah symbolizes. A Jewish altar they could tolerate. The menorah, this is the point of contention. This is the point of difference. This is where ideologically Yisrael and Yavan are opposed. And this we have to understand. Now let's remind ourselves something about the Greeks, about the Hellenists. And this is a point I think we've made in the past. There is a distinction between Hellenic culture and Hellenist culture. Hellenic culture is the pure culture of Greece as was practiced in Hellas, which is the name for ancient Greece, you know, Athens and all the city-states and all that. The pure, unadulterated, undiluted Greek culture. When Alexander the Great, who was Macedonia, which is really north of Greece, conquered Greece and began to expand his empire into Egypt, Asia Minor, Syria, into Persia. So he brought with him elements of Greek culture. Now it's very, very important to understand why he did this. This is tactical, this is political. Because if you want to control a far-flung empire, you can't do it by sheer force. You know, the communications aren't what they are today. There's only so much military strength available. Whereas you want to create an identification with the capital of the empire. Whereas you want to create a feeling that we are part of the empire. Let's give you an illustration. Canada. Ottawa does not maintain a very strong military presence in, let's say, British Columbia to prevent secession. Why not? Why isn't there a need to have, 250,000 troops in British Columbia just in case they try to secede? And the answer is because British Columbia sees itself as being part of Canada. They don't need to have troops there to prevent it from secession. They identify with the culture of Canada, the values of Canada, the government of Canada, and therefore they are secure. Right? Why don't we have 250,000 troops in Quebec to prevent secession? Because it's not going to help. Right? Either they will or they won't. But the point is that in as much as they do not identify with Canada, or certainly up to a point, secession was a genuine possibility. And the real reason there were no troops there is because Canada, I think, is not willing to let it come to that. In other words, if Quebec would say one day that we want to separate from Canada, I think that the consensus in Canada would be let them go. Because we're not going to have a repetition of the American Civil War over this. But the point is, if you can create some identification with the capital, so then the empire is secure. You don't have to have that military force and repressive decrees, because you can count on the empire holding together. So therefore, Alexander the Great was faced with a very serious problem. How is he going to bring about a state of affairs that the elements in this far-flung empire are going to identify with Hellas, with Greece, with Macedonia? It's going to be through the spread of culture. In other words, by spreading the culture which originated in Hellas, people are going to identify with it. They're going to feel part of it. They're not going to want to secede or break away, because they're going to feel a connection to their adoptive motherland. But on the other hand, you have to be very, very careful what you do, because you don't want to antagonize them by crushing the indigenous culture. So Hellenism was a fantastically brilliant tactical compromise, which is we're going to export to the far-flung reaches of the empire elements of Greek culture, but we're going to create a synthesis between Greek culture and the local indigenous culture. So it wasn't pure Hellenic culture. Hellenist is that blend. In other words, you can still practice your own religion. You can still wear your own types of clothing. You can still eat your own cuisine. But we're going to enrich your lives. We're going to build stadiums where there'll be sport, theaters for drama, libraries. We're going to spread Greek learning, and so on and so forth. And for the most part, people felt, gee, we can have our cake and eat it too. This is wonderful. And we can maintain our old ways of living, our old religions, our own lifestyles, our old professions. At the same time, we have all the benefits of this new, rich culture, which Alexander the Great and his armies are exporting. So yes, we feel we want to be a part of this enterprise. We don't want to break away. And this was his scheme, and it really was a fantastically effective scheme. And in Israel, there was a civil war, Jew against Jew, over this issue. There was one party which was a Hellenist party, and they were willing to embrace Hellenism. There was another party of faithful Jews, and they said, no, we don't want any foreign influence here, and we're willing to fight to the point of self-sacrifice to prevent it from happening. And that's what Chanuka is all about. And by the way, I'll just mention that this really opens and raises the very serious question that if we would have been there, on which side would we have been? In other words, we're celebrating Hanukkah today because we get donuts and latkes and dreidels and presents and all sorts of wonderful things. But are we being honest, intellectually honest? If we would have been there, whose side would we have been on? But in any case, there was this civil war. Now, it happens to be that the Hellenists, and this is recorded in the history books, pulled a stunt. In order to tip the balance of power in their favor, they invited the Syrian Greek king, Antiochus IV, to intervene on their behalf. And Antiochus invaded in order to suppress the religious party, the anti-Hellenist party. But Antiochus did it in a very ham-fisted manner. In other words, he wasn't pushing, at that point, Hellenism, because he saw in authentic Judaism a force antagonistic to Hellenism. He said Judaism must be crushed entirely. And therefore, the tactics that were practiced by Antiochus in Israel were an anomaly. It was unlike anything that happened in any of the other places where Hellenist kings reigned. Everywhere else, as we said, the original Hellenist strategy was to allow for synthesis. Here, it was a fight to the finish, because Judaism was perceived as a force that was antagonistic to Hellenism. Judaism, authentic Judaism, had to be crushed. And of course, those were the oppressive decrees of Antiochus, and that's what the story of Chanuka is all about, the defeat of Antiochus, driving him out. So this battle over here is not simply a battle for territory or for power. There's an ideological issue over here. In other words, authentic Judaism versus Hellenism. And we have to explore some of the aspects of this, some of the aspects of the Hellenist culture. Alexander the Great was tutored by Aristotle. It's hard to imagine. Imagine that. Aristotle was his tutor. It's an amazing thing. There was a Jew here in Toronto. He passed away a number of years ago. It was Dr. Rosenblum. And I remember attending his funeral, and one of the speakers mentioned that we knew him as an old man. He came to live with his children here in Toronto, but he was a professor of mathematics in Princeton. A quite distinguished academic career. Now that was interesting, but the real interesting thing was he shared a carpool with Einstein. You imagine that, right? In other words, they had a carpool. Every day they came to the university, and Einstein was one of the people in the carpool. Now Einstein never got to drive because he was such a genius. People were scared to drive with him. Maybe not a license, who knows? So they picked him up every day. But imagine. So imagine, okay, being in a carpool with Einstein is unbelievable. But imagine being tutored by Aristotle. I mean, that's incredible. And Alexander the Great was tutored by Aristotle. Now, I can't say Alexander the Great was the best student of his. It certainly seems that Alexander the Great did not live a life which was informed by wisdom. But I think that certainly in the classic texts we find that the ideology of Hellenism was very much shaped by the revolution that Aristotle was instrumental in the beginning. And it's very interesting. This is something which is fairly well known, that the great Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, were considered in their time subversive, because their teachings were regarded as a force which served to undermine the traditional religion. That really was the charge for which Socrates was put on trial and executed. But why was that? Why was that? See, this relates to something about the Greek religion, about the Greek mythologies. If you read the Greek myths, interestingly, were really, and this is the funny way of putting it, were a form of science. They were the attempt of the ancient peoples to understand the world around them. the gods were personifications of the forces of nature. So when you talk about the god of lightning and the god of thunder and the god of rain and the god of this and the god of that, in other words, these deities were personifications of forces of nature. And in their conflicts and their rivalries and their grievances, we had explanations for natural phenomena. And this is an amazing thing. This is an amazing thing that man had reached the point where he was so curious about his world that he sought explanations. He wanted explanations. And the first explanations were these primitive mythological ones. But then, as science developed, and now we have rational explanations, or explanations that really make sense. We've identified laws of nature that are inviolate and control the world in which we live. The myths became superfluous. So maybe out of nostalgia, people still practice their old-time religion, but it's easy to see how the science of the Greeks would have totally demolished the old religion. Totally demolished the old religion. And the Chachma, the wisdom of Greece, was a wisdom which did not derive from the gods. It was a wisdom that replaced the gods, that supplanted the gods. It was wisdom comes from within, from our understanding, comes from our understanding and study of the world. This is where we receive enlightenment from. Enlightenment doesn't come from the gods. Enlightenment comes from ourselves, from our minds, and from the world around us. Because we don't see it that way. In other words, a Jew can be a scientist. He can be a practitioner of the same scientific enterprise. But he understands that God is the source of all existence, and God is ultimately the source of all wisdom. And it's an amazing thing that the Talmud tells us that when you see a wise person, there's a blessing you recite. So if you see a Torah scholar, like a magnificent Torah scholar, the blessing you say is, "Blessed is God who shared his wisdom with those who fear him." Baruch shecholak michachmasu b'reya. Blessed is God who shares his wisdom with those who fear him. If you see a scientist, if you see a wise person in secular learning, there's a blessing as well. It says, Baruch shenasan michachmasu l'basar v'dam. Blessed is God who gives wisdom to flesh and blood. In other words, even the scientist is perceived as the beneficiary of enlightenment that ultimately comes from God, which is something totally antithetical to the Greek way of seeing things. The altar, the Greeks had no problem with. But even with the expansion of science and philosophy, they kept on the old practices of religion, and they offered sacrifices. If you read Socrates' Apology, the dialogue of Plato, which describes Socrates' last words on earth, his very last words were to remind Plato that he had made a vow to bring a sacrifice to one of the gods and to make sure that it is brought even after he dies. Or Socrates himself, perhaps the logical extension of his thought would have been to undermine the gods. But he himself worshipped them, and he wanted sacrifices as well, and he was scrupulous. He was scrupulous. He wanted to make sure that even after he died, the sacrifice was brought to the appropriate god. It almost reminds me of the wonderful quotation attributed to Moses Mendelssohn. That Mendelssohn was, of course, a famous Jewish philosopher, and again, within his philosophy, much more value was placed on fundamental theology, the belief in the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, than on revealed commandments, to the extent that the revealed commandments played a very minor role in this philosophical system. So he was asked that if you don't believe that philosophically the mitzvahs are important, why do you practice them? Mendelssohn was a very scrupulous practitioner of religion. In fact, it said that he never missed a mincha in his lifetime. It's pretty good. Just to be honest, I can't even say the same thing myself. So Mendelssohn answered, it's true that on the basis of my philosophy, it should follow that the mitzvahs are important, but by nature I'm a very conservative person. In other words, very cautious person. That he's going to practice the mitzvahs just in case he's wrong. So Socrates might have been hedging his bets as well. That it's true that the extension of his philosophical system would have been to dismiss the ancient gods, but just to make sure, you're going to keep bringing the sacrifices. So the Greeks had no problem with the altar, but to credit the gods as the source of their spiritual enlightenment, that they couldn't bring themselves to do. And therefore, it all revolved around the menorah, which is the channel through which we receive spiritual enlightenment. This was the point of contention. Not on the conscious level, necessarily. The Greeks were rampaging through the temple. But God wanted to signal to the Jews that this is the point. This is where you are divided. This is the point of contention. It's the menorah. Therefore, God performed a miracle for the menorah, not for the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach was reconstructed by natural means. But God performed a miracle with the menorah to signal to the Jews, this is the point of division. This is where we are divided with Yahweh. And as Jews, we have to proclaim that we recognize God as the source of our enlightenment. Now let me tell you what the corollary of this is. There's a very beautiful medrash that brings a verse which says about God that Yahiv Chachma L'Chakimin. God gives wisdom to the wise. Now, that's a very peculiar verse, because why should God give wisdom to the wise? They're already wise. God should better give wisdom to the stupid, right? So the Medrash says like this. The Medrash says, a mashal, to explain this. A parable. So imagine a person has money, and he's willing to lend the money. In modern times, that's called the gemach, free loan fund. He's willing to make loans interest-free. So who is he going to lend the money to? To a poor person who has no way of paying back? Or to a rich person who he's confident will pay back? So it makes sense to lend it to the rich person, not the poor person. Likewise, who should God give wisdom to? To the wise person who will use it properly, not to the foolish person who will squander it. So the question is asked that the parable has no connection to what we're trying to prove. In other words, if you're making a loan, it's true, you make the loan to the wealthy person, not to the poor person, because you want to get the money back. But if you're giving a gift, who do you give it to?
Poor.
If you're giving charity, you don't give charity to a rich person, you give charity to a poor person who needs it. So when God gives wisdom, is it a loan or a gift? It seems to be a gift. So if it's a gift, you should give it to the person who needs it more, to the foolish person, not to the smart person. The answer is that wisdom is not a gift. It's a loan. It's a loan. In other words, God is not giving it to you for yourself. It's not yours to squander. He's giving it to you to use and pay back. And therefore, who does he give it to? He gives it to the person in whom he has confidence that he'll use it properly, not to the person who will squander it. And if we have been blessed with a certain amount of wisdom and opportunities to learn, opportunities to receive an education, we shouldn't assume that this is ours to squander. It's a loan, it's a trust. Better, it's a trust. In other words, it's ours to be used for a very specific purpose, to be used for lives of meaning, lives of purpose, lives that God would approve of, and not, God forbid, the opposite. I was reading recently an article about John Rock. You know who John Rock is? Heard of John Rock? John Rock developed the first oral contraceptive, the pill. And John Rock was a devout Catholic. He was a devout Catholic. And he was convinced that the way the pill is meant to work, the Catholic Church would approve of it. He was convinced, he was persuaded. He held that it was just an artificial extension of the rhythm method. And he held that it would work for sure. He had no doubt about it. And when the Pope came out with an encyclical against oral contraception, he was flabbergasted. He was totally shocked. And he gave up his Catholicism, as a result. And he died, I guess, not in a state of grace, as they would say. But it was interesting is this, that he was given, knowledge, wisdom, ingenuity, which within his value system, he thought he would use in the service of his religion. And when he saw that the hierarchy of his religion said no, so at that point, what should his decision have been? Because as a Catholic, his decision should have been to accept the ruling of the church. But there was too much invested personally here. Now, this was his life. And I'm not saying I would have been any better, but he succumbed to the terrible, terrible temptation, and he gave up his religion for that. I mean, this is the type of question. I'm not saying any of us should ever be faced with it, but really this is the question. As we're given the gift of wisdom, and we're meant to use it the right way, will we ever be able to resist that challenge? If we find ourselves using it the wrong way, and we are called to task for our error, will we be able to stop on a dime? Or will we have too much invested? That we're not going to be able to say that I'm ready to put aside my life's work, and instead we'll just give up our religion. I mean, it's a frightening question. Frightening question. But that we have to understand, our intelligence, our learning, our education is a trust. It's given to us to serve God, to make a contribution in the world that He would approve of. And by the way, the Jewish Pope approves of oral contraception under well-defined conditions. It's not a categorical ban. It's a point of law, and a question has to be asked. But the point is, there's no Jewish Pope, it's joking. I mean, the Jewish halachic authorities discuss the question. But this is something that we have to be mindful of, that our wisdom is a gift from God to be used in the right way, and never to be squandered in the way that God wouldn't approve of. But this is what Chanuka is about. Chanuka, the point of conflict between us and Yahweh, is precisely over this question. Because what is the source of our spiritual enlightenment? If the source of it is our own minds and the world around us, so then we're free to use it as we want, without restraint. And to the contrary, the spread of wisdom led to the dismissal of the gods. Kind of like John Rock. And to the Jew, it's never that way. To the Jew, since the source of our spiritual enlightenment is God, our wisdom can never be used to estrange us from God. It's a gift from Him which can only be used to serve Him and to live in accordance with His will. And that's a very, very big ideological gap. God performed a miracle around the menorah to bring this point home, that this is the symbol of the difference. It's not a question of being able to perform a mitzvah. It's not a question of being able to perform a mitzvah in the best possible way. It's what the menorah symbolizes, and that's the meaning of that cryptic statement of the Ramchal. He says that the fight was over the menorah. It was over what the menorah stood for. And when the Jews were victorious, not only in the military battle, but in the ideological battle, God wanted to confirm that by performing the miracle just there. Everyone should have a happy Hanukkah. And by the way, at the same time that we discussed these very profound thoughts, you can also enjoy Hanukkah too. Don't have too many donuts, but fair share. Okay. See you next week.